Following the Golden Dream by Cynthia Clampett. Hopes and dreams. The dreams for coming to the United States may have been different, but they had the same result. They made people come here. Some people followed the promise of building a home and a future, while others pursued the often unreliable hope of gaining quick wealth. The dreams pulled people across the plains or across the seas. They drew people to places that were both difficult and full of possibilities. Following these dreams changed people's lives, and it changed the United States. By 1850, the United States extended from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. Texas and California were states, cities had been born, and the United States had become one of the top gold-producing nations in the world. This growth was caused by more than dreams, however. Many Americans had begun to believe it was the nation's manifest destiny to grow. More land meant greater strength for the country and fewer borders to protect. It meant more opportunities for the city's poor and the thousands of immigrants who continued to arrive. Also, part of the West was a land of freedom for escaped enslaved people. The West had to be opened up. Hundreds of thousands of people were depending on it. Unfortunately, this expansion did not come without a cost. American Indians were often pushed aside as newcomers laid claim to land they had been living on, or gold miners took over waterways they used to fish. Thousands of people died on the trails or during conflicts. However, people still came to pursue their dreams. Opening up the West. Before the dreamers could head west, the land had to be explored, and trails had to be blazed or marked. It was the mountain men who opened up the West. These fur trappers, traders, and scouts made the unexplored regions their home. They blazed the great western trails and stirred interest in this new land with their tales of great forests and fertile valleys. The mountain men, who traded with American Indians, could usually speak several American Indian languages. They sometimes wore American Indian clothing and often married American Indian women. In time, this contact created problems. It made the American Indians increasingly dependent on manufactured goods and sometimes led to the spread of diseases. It created competition for trade goods among groups that had never before been enemies. In the early 1800s, however, life in the unspoiled land seemed beautiful and exciting to the mountain men, and they believed there was much work to be done. John Colter traveled with Lewis and Clark before becoming a trapper and scout. He traveled on foot through the mountains in the area that is now Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. In 1807, he became the first American to see the area American Indians called Yellowstone. His tales of boiling mud and geysers shooting hundreds of feet into the air were not believed. People thought he had lost his mind. Jedediah Smith probably made his first trip west as a teenager. In 1824, he was part of a group that opened a passage to the northwest through Wyoming. 2 years later, Smith found a westward route to California, and he and the traders he was leading became the first Americans to enter California from the east. Smith was also the first American to cross the Sierra Nevada and the first to reach Oregon by traveling up the Pacific coast. Smith's adventures were often dangerous. He nearly died of thirst in the desert, was almost killed by a grizzly bear, and survived several attacks by American Indians. While traveling in the Southwest, Smith was finally killed by the Comanche. Jim Bridger's name lives on in the Bridger Range in Montana, Bridger Pass in southern Wyoming, and Bridger-Teton National Forest in western Wyoming. Bridger explored a territory that ranged from the Canadian border to New Mexico. Jim Beckworth, the son of an enslaved African-American woman, headed west when he gained his freedom. He found a pass through the Sierra Nevada that later became part of the Overland Trail to California. Kit Carson was a mountain man who became a folk hero. Carson ran away from home as a teenager and joined a group of trappers and frontiersmen. He became a scout for the United States military. In 1854, he was appointed to be an American Indian agent. He became well known for his fairness and sympathy for the problems faced by the American Indians. By the time the days of the mountain men were over, in about 1850, the West had been opened up and trails had been blazed to present-day Oregon, California, and New Mexico. People other than explorers were beginning to follow these trails. Oregon country. John Jacob Astor thought that opening a trading post in the Pacific Northwest would increase his already successful business. He hoped to buy furs and ship them to Asia, where there was a great demand. In 1811, he opened his trading post at the mouth of the Columbia River. However, the British controlled most of the fur trade in the region, and Astor's trading post was a failure. Increased activity by British fur traders worried the United States government, but in 1818 the two countries agreed that they could share the part of the Northwest known as Oregon country, an area that included all of present-day Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, and parts of Montana, Wyoming, and British Columbia. In 1819, a treaty between the United States and Spain set Oregon's southern border, and Spain agreed not to settle Oregon. Many settlers went west, including Marcus Whitman, a young doctor, and his wife, Narcissa Prentice Whitman. The Whitmans traveled to Oregon in 1836, setting up a mission near present-day Walla Walla, Washington. They taught the Cayuse how to build houses, plow fields, irrigate crops, and build mills to grind corn and wheat. Narcissa started a school, and Dr. Whitman treated the Cayuse, along with missionaries and other people in the region. In 1842, the Whitmans received news that their assignment was going to end. Marcus Whitman made a 3,000-mile journey on horseback to Boston to ask that their work be continued. He then journeyed to Washington, D.C., to persuade federal officials to encourage settlement in Oregon. As Whitman returned to Oregon country in 1843, he joined a group of nearly 1,000 immigrants who were heading west. He guided their wagon train across the country, and it was because of his efforts that they succeeded in crossing the mountains to the Columbia River. This event became known as the Great Migration. This Great Migration convinced many people that the Oregon Trail was safe. By the mid-1840s, 6,000 settlers had moved to Oregon country. This sudden increase in settlement forced the United States and Great Britain to reconsider their agreement about Oregon. In 1846, the United States accepted the British suggestion that the northern border of Oregon be set at 49 degrees latitude, as was the rest of the United States and the Canadian border. With this area now officially part of the United States, more migration took place. Wagon trains of as many as 100 covered wagons were soon crossing the continent. Families loaded all the possessions they could fit into these wagons. The 2,000-mile journey could take as many as 4 to 6 months to complete. While on the Oregon Trail, everyone generally rose at 4 a.m. and was ready to depart by 7 a.m. The wagon train would travel all day, stopping by 4 p.m. to graze horses and cattle, prepare meals, and make repairs. Children could play once their chores were done, and violins or guitars were sometimes brought out to provide entertainment. Mountains and rivers were difficult to cross. Thunderstorms, strong winds, and snow could make traveling extremely difficult and dangerous. Contaminated water or food often caused sickness and even death to sweep through groups of travelers, and the Oregon Trail became lined with graves. However, the promise of a new life and the possibility of escaping poverty motivated people to continue on the trail. During the 1840s, about 12,000 people used the Oregon Trail to reach the Pacific Northwest. Of all the great overland routes to the west, the Oregon Trail was used the longest. Mexican land, United States land. The 1800s were a time of turmoil in Mexico. In 1821, Agustin Iturbide and Vicente Guerrero raised an army and took control of most of Mexico. Spain appointed its own military officer to govern Mexico, but it was too late to regain control. The Treaty of Cordoba, signed on August 24, 1821, gave Mexico its independence from Spain. Iturbide crowned himself Emperor of Mexico in 1822, and the United States gave formal recognition to the Mexican Empire. The military, headed by Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, revolted against the emperor the next year. Iturbide was forced from power, and in 1824 he was arrested and shot. Santa Anna declared that Mexico was now a republic. Men were given the right to vote. Government protections, however, were removed for native peoples, who were now worse off than under Spanish rule. Different military groups began fighting for control, and the government changed hands every year or two. Mexico's debts skyrocketed. By 1833, Santa Anna was again in charge, this time as president. Santa Anna adopted a new constitution in 1836, one that eliminated states' rights. The people most affected by this were the 30,000 United States immigrants who had been invited to settle the previously undeveloped area known as Texas. When the Texans revolted, Santa Anna crushed the first group he encountered at the Alamo in February 1836. Santa Anna's army was then defeated by Sam Houston's troops in April 1836, and Santa Anna was captured. In exchange for his freedom, Santa Anna promised not to try to recapture Texas, but he refused to recognize its independence. When the United States annexed Texas in 1845, the Mexican people removed Santa Anna from power because he had been willing to negotiate with the United States. President James Polk tried to make peace. He offered Mexico $30 million for New Mexico and California. Mexico needed the money badly, but refused. When United States troops occupied the Texas borderlands that Mexico claimed as its own territory, the Mexican troops attacked them in April 1846. Polk saw this as an act of war. The Mexican War lasted until February 1848. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the war, gave the United States a vast territory that included most of the American Southwest. It also gave Mexico $15 million and granted citizenship to the 75,000 Mexicans living in the Southwest. The lure of gold. Only a few days before Mexico signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, a carpenter from New Jersey named James Wilson Marshall picked up a few yellow pebbles in a California stream. The pebbles turned out to be gold. John Sutter, a rancher from Switzerland, owned the land where the gold was found. Sutter knew that news of the discovery could ruin everything he had built and that people would come by the thousands and overrun his land. He asked his workers to tell no one, but word leaked out anyway. With no telephones or telegraphs, the news spread slowly at first from friend to friend, but everyone who heard soon headed for Sutter's land. By March 1848, several newspapers had published the story of Marshall's discovery. The news electrified the country and sped around the world. California had never attracted large numbers of people. Much of the state was dry, with little of the fertile land that drew farmers to Oregon. It was mountainous and hard to reach. During the Mexican War, Mexico had hardly bothered to defend California. Now suddenly, everyone wanted to go there. The gold rush was on. As gold fever took hold, people left their homes and their jobs. Soldiers deserted their camps. Stores and schools were closed, and farms were abandoned. In 1 year, 80,000 men flooded into California. Sutter's fears proved correct, and within a few months his land was covered with tents and was being torn up by miners' picks and shovels. The first prospectors, or people who came searching for gold, were called 49ers because they arrived in 1849. There was great ethnic diversity among the prospectors, with dozens of languages spoken on the gold fields, but most of those who arrived in 1849 were men. Life in the gold fields was not pleasant. Most miners lived in small tents, and there were few services such as doctors or barbers. Without any laws, government, or police, mining camps were lawless and dangerous places. Few people wanted their wives or daughters to face these hardships, though a few women did make the trip, some even to search for gold. While life was not easy for the miners, it was very hard for the region's American Indians. Some joined the rush for gold, but many were driven off by hostile prospectors and forced to flee. Those who stayed found their lands and waterways ruined as digging continued. Californios, the Hispanics who lived in California before it became part of the United States, also found their land overrun. The poverty that resulted from losing their land and livelihood would last for decades after the gold rush ended. By 1853, a total of 250,000 fortune seekers had arrived in California, which had become a state in 1850. Though many prospectors left for the big gold rush in Australia in 1851, and many of the disappointed moved back east, California continued to grow as settlers replaced the miners. The gold rush was over, but California was just getting started.